El canto vacío nacido en suspiro de lo vivido.
Hello and welcome to this edition of The Pill. I'm in Buenos Aires for a change, in my hometown, so the Pill will take place in Latin America. However, it's going to be dedicated to Lygia Clark's retrospective that is taking place at the Modern Museum of Art in New York, at the MoMA. And the retrospective is called Lygia Clark 1948-1988, Abandonment of Art. And it's relevant for our discussions because it's a conflation of the two things that we were discussing here. Firstly, with Marina Abramovich's show at the Serpentine Gallery, which that attempt to package human experience in a corporate zombie world. And on the other side, we have this attempt to turn concrete geometric abstraction in Latin America into something ornamental, as we had seen at the Royal Academy of Art in London with the collection of Patricia Phelps de Cisneros. And finally, we see something of what we can see at the Guggenheim UBS MAP initiative, curated by Pablo León de la Barra at, as I said, it's a Guggenheim Museum, called Latin American Art Today, which shows Latin American in a bananified, colorful, harmless, sanitized way. So I hope you enjoy it, and let's get ready for the Lygia Clark's experience. There is a common denominator between the way the Lygia Clark show was reviewed by Roberta Smith for the New York Times and the way it was both curated and sponsored, and that is what I want to explore here. I want to use the tools of art criticism to tackle the manipulation that Lygia Clark's work has suffered not only in its presentation but also in its public assessment, only to show that it is almost impossible to exhibit Latin American art in New York and London for what it is and without sanitizing it. This is the first time the work of Lygia Clark, 1920-1988, is presented to a North American public, so it is especially relevant to see how is that presentation organized, both at the level of the museum and of the critics. It is true that some of her earlier paintings and sculptures have been included in the recent surveys of Latin American art, staged both in Europe and the US. Clark could not be left out of such shows because she has long been recognized in her native Brazil and increasingly in other countries as an artist of the first importance. But she could not be properly represented either because her work has not fitted within the institutional framework and the rather conventional notion of the work of art which surveys are based on. This with the exception of such shows as Marina Abramovich's retrospective at MoMA, where art becomes an opportunity to experience something that is presented, although it hardly is, as real and encourages the public's participation. Individual exhibitions of Clark's work outside Brazil up to now have been very few. One at Signals, an experimental art space in London, in 1965, one at the Brazilian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 1968, and a few others. An excellent retrospective was held in Rio de Janeiro at the Paco Imperial, jointly with Elio Oteixica in 1986, 2 years before she died. Aside from these shows, from the late 60s, her work had not reached the Anglo-Saxon public through an exhibition format. Clark began as a painter in the late 50s, producing small monochrome paintings, reliefs. Those were followed by her own brand of neo-constructivist sculptures. In the 60s, her work took a more conceptual direction towards often ephemeral or soft objects associated with mutability and viewers' participation. She developed a more elaborately collective way of working during the 70s, as she explored sensory participation and psychic interaction of various sorts, what she called ritual without myth. The final phase of her work moved into actual psychotherapy and healing. But who did she want to heal? Which kind of human beings is she aiming at healing? For that, we have to delve into the actual conditions of production that she faced and the socio-political context where this happened. We cannot understand her work without trying to understand Brazil. The evolution of Clark's work may perhaps be summed up as a radical journey beyond the traditional relationship between artist and spectator. Traditionally, the artist is the giver of a communication and the spectator the receiver. This transaction is mediated by the artwork. The artwork is expressly constructed to be apprehended by the visual senses. Art making is part of an ongoing process which itself, over time, has refined the visual sense in isolation from the other senses and independent of the body as a whole. The artist produces a representation, a compressed sign of some form of physical fact, life experience, or spiritual energy which is encoded in the work of art. This is then decoded and read by the spectator, and to some extent relieved by him or her. Suppose instead that the artist's production was not her own encoded expressivity directed toward the other person as spectator, but provided some means for that other person to become conscious of his or her own expressivity in the role of the participant. The roles of artist, spectator, and mediating objects would all change. Since the object would no longer be a representation, it would have no meaning or structure outside the participants as whole plurisensorial beings. The external shape of this object would no longer have primary importance, since it would not be intended exclusively for the eye, nor even for the other senses explicitly defined, but for something vaguer, broader. As the Brazilian writer and psychologist Lula Wanderley has put it, the relational objects of Lygia Clark depend not on a sensorial outlining of shape nor some quality of surface, but on something that dilutes the notion of surface and makes the object to live in an imaginary inwardness of the body, where it finds signification. This is where the frontier is broken between the body and the object, and the inside and the outside of the body. This could be read from a phenomenological perspective, but also from a socio-political perspective. According to the former, there is an evolution from painting towards psychotherapy. For Clark, this was not a change of métier, but a continuum in which the implications of her experiments change our understanding of what artist may mean. She moved from a visual language in the purest sense to a language of the body, not performed or spectated, but lived by the participant, in a way which enabled an efficacious, healing relationship to take place in the face of life's crisis. But her work emerged in a politically charged environment. In our previous depil on the UBS MAP initiative Latin American Art Today, called Under the Sun, at the Guggenheim Museum, we were talking about the emergence of Brazilian tropicalism and Lygia Clark's close links to the art of Hélio Oiticica and the artistic movement that aimed at transforming art into a tool for political change in Latin America, especially after Paris 1968. We're talking about the late 60s in Latin America, and about the relationship between politics and art. While in Argentina, this conceptualist trend was moving towards the dematerialization of the work of art, in Brazil, it was moving towards open participation. In the words of the infamous porno curator Pablo León de la Barra at the Guggenheim Museum, and I'm quoting him, "In words of Oiticica, as can be seen, the myth of tropically is much more than parrots and banana trees. It is the consciousness of being conditioned by established structures, hence highly revolutionary in its entirety. Any conformity, be it intellectual, social, or existential, is contrary to its principal ideals." In fact, at the opening night at the Opinión 65 exhibition at Museum of Modern Art in Rio in 1965, Otishika and his friends from the Mangueira Samba School entered the museum, which until then had been a sanctuary of the Carioca elite and high art, wearing parangolés, colored capes and banners he had developed with the inhabitants of the Morro of Mangueira. By means of this artistic political act, those normally excluded from the institution took over it. Soon afterwards, Otishika developed a series of environments he called penetraves. These included Tropicalia, 1967, that we can see now, and Eden, 1969. For this, he said, I created a tropical scenario, as it were, with plants, parrots, sands, pebbles. He explained, it seemed to me, while walking about the environs and set of Tropicalia, that I was going through the gullies and over the curves of the Morro, which were organic, like the fantastic architecture of the slums, another life experience. So De la Barra concludes that Otishika collapsed the relationship between exhibitions, art objects, and everyday objects, transforming the space into an experiential one. His major contribution to art was in the transformation of the spectator from passive viewer into active participant. So, as we can see, both Elio Otishika and Lygia Clark's participatory approaches to art constitute a radical social statement against social polarization and political dictatorships. So, let's talk about social polarization and how the mega-rich MoMA donors at the MoMA at this show conceive this kind of art. According to MoMA's webpage, this show has been mainly supported by Ricardo and Susana Steinbrück, the Modern Women's Fund, Patricia Phelps de Cisneros, again, and Jerry Spire. Regarding Patricia Phelps de Cisneros, we discussed her aesthetic criteria in our previous to the last CAñETE'S The Pill, which I dedicated to the geometric art from her collection, called Radical Abstraction at the Royal Academy of Art in London. But I think it might be useful to focus now on the other sponsor, the other patron, Jerry Spire, who I have met a few times in the past. He's a New York property mogul. He owns the Empire State Building and the Rockefeller Center. An art lover and collector, he has been Marina Abramovich's main sponsor for her retrospective at MoMA, and seems to be very interested in what we could call participatory art, as in Abramovich and Lygia Clark. I met him at his office in 30 Rockefeller Center a few years ago. It is a white cube placed inside a glass box inside the Noguchi-inspired Zen terrace overlooking St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. It's amazing. His collection is, according to him, composed by pieces that he loves, and he boasts about not collecting as an investment, but for pleasure. This is true. However, what is his taste? What gives him pleasure? Which aesthetics appeal to Jerry Spire? His office is decorated by minimal art objects. I would say that Jerry Spire, as a real estate mogul and art collector, is an interiors decorator. And when he gives money, he wants people to participate in that experience. He kind of like measures money by visitors or by visitors' experience. That is why these artists who are keen on enhancing the viewer's participation are particularly appealing to him. The other considerations regarding the relationship with avant-garde or the political implications of that participation are completely foreign to him and seem to him irrelevant. When I talked about these issues to him, he literally fell asleep in front of me. Having said this, it surprised me that the New York Times legendary art critic Roberta Smith has reviewed this show as if Lygia Clark had come from nowhere. The naive formalism that Smith uses to talk about Clark's work ignores all political implications and sterilized this show so as to transform it into the kind of sanitized entertainment that people like Jerry Spire seem to love. So let's see what Roberta Smith has to say about this show. The show, says Roberta Smith, I'm quoting Roberta Smith in the next 5 minutes, signals something of a letdown, especially if you like art. But once you've worked your way through this up and down massing of some 300 works, equally fitting and less stark alternatives may come to mind. including the expansion of art and the internalization of art. Because Clark didn't so much abandon art as push it slowly, painstakingly, and even logically to a place where objects and materials were meant to be handled and viewers became participants, alone or in groups. Lygia Clark devised a process she called structuring of the self, a kind of psychophysical therapy or healing process that might also be called bodywork, and for some time in the late 1970s and 80s she practiced it on private clients before reversing her abandonment and turning back to art in the last years of her life. One of the most fascinating of the participatory works is captured in a grainy video in the show's final gallery, which is hung with masks, hazmat-worthy bodysuits, and a small eccentric DIY object that Clark devised for her participants, and later her clients, along with the photographs of them in use. My favorite is a plastic bag with a rubber band around its middle that contains water and a few handfuls of small shells, which I definitely want to try at home. The video depicts Anthropophagic's Lover, which was first enacted in 1973 by Clark's students at the Sorbonne, where she taught a course on gestural communication for several years. Once you've gotten past the yeah factor of the description of this sensorial proposition, as Clark called it, it is both beautiful and rather brilliant. So here goes. One person, sparsely clothed, the label says, lies down, and several others gathered around, each with a spool of colored thread in the mouth. They proceed to pull out and drizzle the thread, wet with saliva, over the face and body of their prone collaborator, forming a fine and random web of different colors. Although you may have to read the label to understand exactly where it's coming from, the delicate growing web of thread precipitated by the close circle of people is too eerie and suggestive and just plain intense not to watch for a while. It mesmerizes, suggesting some ancient rite, primitive and deep, whether of birth, baptism, initiation or burial. None of these rules out a sci-fi aspect. We could also be watching the cultivation of a second skin, a protective net, or a complex wiring that the body will ultimately absorb to gain superhuman powers. Spider-Man? And then perhaps we are back at here, the primordial intimacy of the threads, mouth-to-body transfer of the gentile forcing of the participants into a collective experience that only they can know fully. It seems bound to be charged, and to provide valuable insight into human connection. How many people would participate with the promise of such insight? Who knows? Think about the speed with which you might perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on a stranger or help one give birth, as recently happened on a New York sidewalk, and the kinds of bonds that emerge from such encounters. For further insight, I recommend reading one of the show catalog's 10 essays in which the performance artist and professor Eleonora Fabian writes about her own participation in Anthropophagic's Lover, which will be activated by facilitators in the words of the museum's news release at unannounced times. So now let's stop a little bit with Roberta Smith and let's see how the MoMA refers to these experiences.
Clark used elastic bands in several experimental works meant to be activated by a group of people. If a facilitator is present, you are encouraged to participate in making the net and experimenting with its range of movements.
These elastic bands attached to each other allow a complex structure, a complex grid. A group of persons can play with them by pushing and pulling these elastic bands.
The bands form a web of changing geometric lines, pursuing the theme of Clark's earlier investigations into the nature of the line.
In her late work, she produced and proposed a series of experiences with thread and these elastic bands to physically produce lines in the space that allow bodies to connect so they can be conceived as a collective body, as if the lines were the metaphors of the fusion she was looking for.
Clark called these suits Oeo, Eo2, or the I and the U. She initially meant for them to be experienced by a male and a female participant. Their interaction with each other and the suits forms the meaning of the work. She said,
What's important is the act of doing in the present. The artist is dissolved into the world.
Inside each suit are pockets containing different materials. Two participants of any gender can explore these materials, both in their own suit and in each other's. Connie Butler.
In the I and the you, the cord that joins the two participants we can read as some kind of umbilical cord, but also the exploration that the man and the woman are engaging in can be seen as neutral, but certainly can also be seen in gendered and sexual terms. The subject's eyes are covered by these sensorial masks. So what I think is possible is that while the subjects begin gendered as male and female, that as the exploration of the body is begun by these different subjects, that in some ways the subjects lose their gender, that they become all sensory experience, all skin, all body, all material.
Clark created her sensorial objects from ordinary materials found in the streets and stores of Rio de Janeiro. Connie Butler.
Respire Conmigo, for example, or Breathe With Me, is made from an aquatic air tube used by divers at the time, and she begins to extract this kind of everyday object as a way to express her ideas about the body and about the participation of the viewer.
Clark described how the piece was to be used.
When activated near the ear, this rubber hose provides a measure of the body's breathing, revealing the living lung itself. When we become aware of the rhythm of the body, we do not quickly forget it.
Your own breathing echoes that of the tube's breathing as you activate it. Works like this can be understood within the context of the extreme political repression in Brazil during the 1960s and 70s.
It's a time when colleagues and friends of Clark's and people in general are being incarcerated, are being disappeared, where bodies under repression, under suppression and manipulation of various kinds would have been part of the daily experience of the news, but also of daily life. So in some ways, we might understand Respire Conmigo or Breathe With Me, both as an experience of the breathing in and out, the simple activity of the human body, but also one of constriction and release.
So far, we referred to the way MoMA and its curators have manipulated Lygia Clark's work through certain conceptual displacements in the way they were deploying words and concepts. But now I want to go back to our discussion with Roberta Smith and the New York Times to see how this also happens at the level of the criticism, at the top level criticism of the New York Times. So now I'm quoting Roberta Smith. Clark's career has a forced growth quality in which the journey is almost more impressive than any one stop along the way. It actually spans more years in art time than the length of her life, but at times she seems to stall in repetition, as if she couldn't be bothered to develop her own ideas. The thorough line is an attraction to intimate scale and a kind of spiraling space in which inside and outside become one. The show is laid out in 4 large galleries, each dense with a different kind of art, like a series of well-cultivated gardens. First comes painting. After a few capable representational preliminaries, in the early 1950s she moves on to several varieties of geometric abstraction, often in beautiful colors that reach back to the Russian constructivism of the late 1910s, as well as to Paul Klee and Mondrian, the latter an artist she admired enough to address in an imaginary letter reprinted in the catalogue. These works qualified her for membership in the self-consciously avant-garde neo-concrete group, which also included Elio Odescicca, a younger painter and lifelong friend with similar interests in activity. The paintings then become increasingly physical, and the incised lines begin to tilt diagonally, leading to a second gallery where a series of interlocking black and white compositions are investigated almost ad nauseam in works that are very much in tune with those of Joseph Albers and Ellsworth Kelly. Soon Clark is making similar works in metal, which enables them to be shaped and the black and white planes to angle outward, which finally takes Clark into real space. The third gallery is dominated by her best-known works, the small metal sculptures, charmingly named bichos, critters, and related efforts from 1960-1963. Made of mostly cut-out aluminium, their geometric planes are hinged together and bent into various arrangements, a form of post-minimalism before the fact. 3 copies are available for manipulation, which is fun. They resemble toys for visually oriented adults that could easily be sold in the modern gift shop. So it is a little confusing to see from photographs in the catalogue that Clark also considers some of them models for immense, generic public sculptures. Not to be overlooked are 2 vitrines that step out of the chronological flow and contain some of the most satisfying works in the show. Tiny structures made of matchboxes glued together in stacked configurations painted mostly bright red or blue. These compartmentalized structures from 1964, when Clark was edging away from objects, could be plans for houses or furniture. The final gallery comes as a relief, if only because the hard-edged angularity of much of the preceding work relents, giving way to soft, malleable materials that predominate in their improvised objects frequently used in her therapeutic work. Involving balls, rubber gloves, and masks, they often resemble refugees from surrealism, but they mainly suggest that Clark had reached a side of sensibility that she did not live long enough to develop fully in or out of art. Luckily, the catalogue includes examples of Clark's writings and letters which present a fairly full spectrum, from moments of narcissism, such as when she says, "I'm feeling so good that when I wake up my body thanks me," to New Age mumbo-jumbo, to very astute appraisals of her work and that of artists like Albers and Jackson Pollock, whom she saw rightly as antecedents. The exhibition is a lot easier to get through with Clark's driving, mercurial, sometimes pioneering, intelligent whispering in your ear. And this is the end of Roberta Smith's quote. Well, as we have seen, both the New York Times and the Museum of Modern Art in New York have just reduced the work of Lygia Clark to that of a psychotherapist who, by definition, is concerned by individual well-being instead of social reform. Tropicalia was all about a carnivalistic inversion of low over high, fueled by socialist theories. Where is that here in this show? It was all about bringing the people to the museum, but bringing the people from below to the museum. It was all about creating the conditions for social change to happen. This is rather different from visitors' experience, as in the entertainment industry. The progression from neoconcrete to Tropicalia must also be put in context. For all the changes it went through, Lygia Clark's work never quite lost the marks of its grounding in the constructivist movement in Brazil of the 1950s. These were born in a period of great artistic and intellectual excitement in the country. While abstract expressionism was emerging in New York with Jackson Pollock, contemporaneously with l'art informel, l'air brut, and stachisme in Paris, in the aftermath of the war, Brazil was being exposed to the pioneer generation of European abstract artists from the north and from the east. I'm referring to Mondrian, Malevich, Klee, and the Russian constructivists, the Bauhaus, and as well as younger concrete artists like Max Bill and Joseph Albers, who we mentioned before. Their work was seen firsthand at the early Sao Paulo biennials in the 1950s. Bill and Albers both lectured in Brazil during that period. If on the one hand these influences represented the typical delay suffered by peripheral cultures in the arrival of ideas from the metropolitan centers, on the other hand they corresponded to the needs of a progressive middle class intent on developing Brazil. As Ronaldo Brito has written, the Brazilian constructivist movements represented the desire of a new intellectual generation to be absolutely modern. At that time, the reigning style in Brazil was about regionalist realism, associated with artists such as Cândido Portinari, for example, closely identified with the programs of the left political parties. It was illustrative and populist, and its day had been an attempt to assert a notion of Brazilianness in the face of foreign cultural domination. But the neoconcrete tries something different. In a way, the ideals of the absolute modern Brazilian neoconcretists drew heavily on the mathematical abstraction of Max Bill and the ideas for scientifically integrating art into industrial society in a very much German Vorstellung durch Technik kind of way. One can hardly escape the ironies of trying to translate this tidy Swiss-German rationalism with its Calvinist overtones to Brazilian tropical and underdeveloped conditions. Ronaldo Brito speaks of a messianic project on the part of a middle-class vanguard attempting to surmount underdevelopment. Its idealism was another expression of the contradictions of dependence. There was something colonial in their mimicry of Swiss formalist rationalism. However, with Clark, Oitishike and Lygia Pape had a show with the same issues that took place at the Serpentine Gallery a couple of years ago. This all changes. In fact, their Neo-Concrete Manifesto, 1959, called for the reinstatement of the values of intuition, expression and subjectivity. They became anti-rationalist, and as such, they escaped that provincialism that they were being subjected to. As a matter of fact, they said, and I'm quoting them, "If we have to look for an equivalent to the work of art, we will not find it in the machine or even the object as such, but in living organisms." The organic is a key term here. We do not conceive of a work of art as a machine or as an object, but as a quasi-body. But let's see now how this is presented by the Walker Museum and by the MoMA. I'm interested in the clinical way that the curator uses to talk about this in the following video. Let's have a look.
A work like this, which looks, in many cases, like it could be displayed on the wall, but was in fact meant to be opened, folded, and reconfigured by her audience into a range of different shapes, all of which could move, and none of which remain static. There is no right way to show this sculpture, because there is no front, there is no back. Likewise, there's no inside or outside. That lack of distinction, in some sense, parallels Clark's own obsession throughout her life with death and trying to imagine it. In that sense, what looks like a small metal sculpture, and is, in fact, ties into larger existential issues that she was grappling with.
A word that the MoMA seems to ignore is that of anthropophagia or anthropophagy. In 1922, the famous Modern Art Week, roughly equivalent to New York Epochal 1913 Armory Show, was held in Sao Paulo. Its guiding spirit, the great poet Osvaldo de Andrade, reflected much on the character of Brazil's culture. Rather than speaking of mutual influences or the merging of superficial traits between the indigenous Indian culture of Brazil, the Portuguese colonial feudal Catholic systems, the African culture which came with the slaves, and the various waves of later European migration, he used a much more powerful and useful metaphor, anthropophagia, cannibalism. As reformulated in a contemporary definition by Brazil's outstanding poet Haroldo dos Campos, this meant the critical swallowing up of the universal cultural heritage, elaborated not from the submissive reconciling perspective of the good savage, but from the disillusioned viewpoint of the bad savage, the white man-eater, the cannibal. It involves transvaluation, a critical view of history, as well suited to appropriation as to expropriation, this hierarchization or deconstruction. To make things even worse, much of Lygia Clark's work was made under dictatorships that forced communist new abstract painters to use that visual language in order to become cryptic and unattainable. The fact that Clark's critters can change in shape has to do with the protean nature of the creatures that inhabit the tropics. They are very difficult to dominate because they are volatile by definition, and they can, like in the carnival, subvert hierarchies very easily. They are very prone to anthropophagia. It is in this conflation between the political, the social, and the psychological that Lygia Clark's work is relevant. How on earth this is going to be apprehended when both MoMA and the New York Times make an effort to devoid it from all context and political relevance? The question that remains is why MoMA, Jerry Spire, and Phelps de Cisneros insist on transforming her phenomenological approach into something closer to Marina Abramovich's guided presence in times of corporate depersonalization. Is it that they aim at corporate depersonalizing our contemporary art? I think this is food for thought. I see you next time. Thank you.
El canto vacío nacido, en suspiro de lo vivido.